in 1912, there was the foundation of the first openly Marxist party in Latin America, interestingly enough, known as the Partido Obrero Socialista.
Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Ramiro from Anticonquista. Anticonquista is an anti-imperialist media collective. Our content is produced by and for the Latin American and Caribbean diaspora. And today we're talking about the history of socialism in Chile. Chile is a very important country in terms of socialist and communist history, and also anarchist history in Latin America and the Caribbean. I think of a lot of the countries in the region, it has one of the most storied legacies of resistance to capitalism, imperialism, racism, and unfortunately it doesn't get a lot of attention in US labor history and socialist history, even though there's so much we can learn from major events that have happened in Chile. And so I'm hoping to discuss some of this today with our esteemed guest, Bruno Fuentes. Bruno is a writer for Revista de Frente, based in Santiago, Chile. Revista de Frente is an independent media collective that does guerrilla reporting. So they're doing cutting-edge work in Chile, on the grounds, on the front lines with workers, with indigenous people. And so we have just the right person to guide us through the history of socialism in Chile. Bruno, how's it going out there?
It's going, I don't know how you could say. It gets tougher every day over here for the people. But for me, I'm doing good. I'm doing good where I am. I'm very much excited to talk about socialism, in the history of socialism in Chile.
That's what's up. Before we go into the history of socialism in Chile, why don't you tell us a little bit about Revista de Frente and how you discovered socialism? What was your experience like becoming a socialist and a communist?
Well, the way that I became a socialist was that, my family, I'm the only socialist in my family. And the way that I became a socialist was that, growing up, I'd been told a lot of stories about socialism and about specifically the popular unity era. And I would grow up and I would discover that a lot of these things would be lies, and I would go and investigate more and more about them. And this would get me more and more interested. At the same time, when I got into university here, I got into the students' movement, and that got me more interested in politics, and one thing led to another, and I became the black sheep of my family, so to say. And with Revista de Frente, like as you said, we are we like to think of ourselves as a guerrilla de comunicación, as a communication kind of guerrilla. For us, the pen is mightier than the sword. We like to write articles about not only about our opinions, but also what's happening here. We like to challenge the narrative that comes from kind of big media outlets, some of which are from the US, and have a very strong voice on politics here in Chile. So that's what we do, and I'm very happy to be here with you.
Cool. So with that in mind, for people who have never traveled to Chile or let alone South America, if you can quickly just give us a lay of the land. Where is Chile located, first of all? What is its population like, its economy, and its political system?
Well, Chile is in South America. We are to the west of Argentina. We're a very long, skinny country. In the north of Chile, we have the world's driest desert, the Acatama Desert. It's so dry over there that there's parts that don't even have that much sand. They have more salt than anything. And in the kind of center of the country, we have this kind of Mediterranean sort of climate, very similar to what you have in California. And to the south of Chile, we have very big temperate forests, very similar to what you can find in the state of Washington and in Canada. And yeah, we have a very diverse range of climates. We have a very, I'd say, unique history and unique kind of culture, because we have the mountains to the east, so we're not that connected to Argentina, and we have the world's driest desert to the north, so there's not too much movement up there. So we kind of have a very unique and very how do I say, singular culture that you can find here. So it's not alien to other Latin American cultures either.
Cool, that's what's up. And I hope to someday visit Chile myself. I would love to go out there, especially with all the revolutionary history, the landscape, and the nature. I'm sure it's a beautiful place to be. So jumping right into it, we have in 1818, Chile declares independence. By 1844, Chile's independence is recognized. Now, into the 1850s, there's something very interesting that happens where you have people like Francisco Bilbao, Santiago Arcos, and the formation of La Sociedad de la Igualdad. Tell us a little bit about that and the global context of what was going on at the time.
Yeah, well, with the Sociedad de la Igualdad, that was basically a group formed originally by kind of small aristocrats that didn't feel too connected with the rest of the aristocrats of the era, and at the same time they were very inspired by what was happening in France with the French Revolution that, interestingly enough, Karl Marx was a part of. And he would form his own theories during that very time. And what made this group kind of very unique was that they were the first time in which kind of intellectuals and working class or more popular classes would start to unite and start to create a sort of movement. They managed to get support from artisans that saw that their position in society was dwindling. It was fading away as the country started to become slowly but surely more and more industrial. And they started to see their position go from being artisans to being proletarians. And this wasn't sort of socialist in the way that we understood it. It was basically a sort of egalitarian group. They wanted more social equality, but they didn't want a fundamentally completely different system yet. And well, this was in the 1850s. Around the 1880s, Chile had won a war against Peru and Bolivia and had taken the north of Chile from them. And since this war with Peru and Bolivia was conducted by the Chilean elite and not by the popular classes, they sold off most of the nitrate mines to Western imperialist tycoons and companies. So this was, instead of having been a period of bonanza, it became a period of imperialism. One of the biggest tycoons of this era was Thomas North, who was an ex-train conductor, a British ex-train conductor, who sort of placed his bets on Chile winning the war when not many people thought that they would. And he ended up being the prime owner of a big section of the nitrate mines in the north. And with that, he became a millionaire, and he just left to the UK to live in a life of luxury. Meanwhile, he would pay workers in these nitrate mines, he would pay them in tokens. So it would be as if your boss, instead of paying you in real money, he would pay you only in Chuck E. Cheese tokens. And with these tokens, the miners could only buy food that was served only in the cafeterias owned by the mine. So it was almost practically slavery at this point.
It's crazy that around this time period, I know in the 1860s, beginning at that time period, you also have the occupation of Auracania, which is an indigenous land, the land belonging to the Mapuche people who have resisted countless empires. And so around this time period, it's interesting because it may not seem, for people who are not familiar with Chile, it may seem inconsequential, but it actually is very consequential globally, because the nitrates that British settlers like John Thomas North extracted from Chile and occupied Bolivia and Peru during the War of the Pacific, those are the same nitrates that were used for gunpowder against the Indians on the Indian subcontinent as the British Empire was colonizing India and doing the very same things in terms of dividing up, creating borders, creating a Muslim section, Pakistan and Bangladesh, and a Hindu section, India. And the British imperialists played a similar role in the South America, where they were kind of dividing, creating divisions between Chileans, Bolivians, and Peruvians when they should be working together against the British capitalists and imperialists. And so it's just a fascinating time period that I think doesn't get a lot of attention.
Yes, and around this era, now that you mentioned the Mapuches, around this time, right after the war with Peru and Bolivia, the Chilean military finally had a kind of hardened veteran military, and they kind of marched into the Araucania, and they carried out a military campaign that has a euphemism within it. They call it La Pacificación de la Araucanía, the pacification of the Araucania, where they sort of makes it sound as if they didn't massacre people, they pacified them. And in this pacification, they kind of crushed the last two remaining chieftains, Mapuche chieftains that were still insurrect against the Chilean state. And well, there's, even with the end of these two last chieftains, the Mapuches would keep on going and keep on skirmishing with the Chilean state even up to today. But it wasn't at the same level of organization. So with that came kind of like the colonization of the South. The Chilean state would promote kind of European settlers to get to start creating settlements within the South and start kind of instilling the idea of property in the south of Chile. The Mapuches didn't know about property. They didn't live in a capitalist society with the conception of property. This would move a lot of the Mapuche into the cities, in which you can know, like today, 80% of Chileans can trace their ancestry back to Mapuches, including myself. I would be like fourth generation Mapuche, a bit watered down, I guess. But my great grandfather, he was a chieftain.
That's awesome.
And he had to come. Yeah, so going back a little bit to the history, around the 1890s, in the north, you would start to find the first mutual aid organizations that were first organized by anarchists. These organizations would help distribute food, give sort of like the most basic health care they could, try to fill in work for someone when they would be sick, and they would also organize the first strikes in Chile. This also was around the same time you started getting the first kind of left wing, or closer to what we would imagine as the left wing party, with the Democrat Party in Chile. They weren't too worker based, they were just concerned about getting more votes. And sort of this whole era created a series of strikes and worker organizations and militancy, which saw its climax in 1907 with the massacre of Santa Maria de Iquique. And well, in Santa Maria de Iquique, which is in the north of Chile, there was a giant strike, and the owners of the mine sent in the military to crush the strike, and they opened fire on the miners, on their wives, on their children, on everyone. And instead of actually scaring the miners, this only enraged everyone else who heard about it. And at the same time, around the kind of like the early 1900s, you have in Chile this kind of semi-feudal system called the latifundio that you could see all around Latin America. You see it in Peru, you could see it in Central America as well, in Honduras. So in this case, it wasn't too different. But during this time, the South wasn't too organized. It was the North where you would find more organization. And in 1912, there was the foundation of the first openly Marxist party in Latin America, interestingly enough, known as the Partido Obrero Socialista, which was founded by a man known as Luis Emilio Recabaren. Now, Luis Emilio Recabaren, he was an ex-member of the Partido Demócrata. He grew up working in a print shop, and he kind of self-taught himself how to read. And in this print shop, he would start to find the first kind of philosophical books about socialism. And from an early age, he would start to write about socialism, about workers' rights, about all these crazy things that people would tell him. It was like, what are you talking about? Workers' rights, minimum wage, nonsense. And he was a key organizer in the strikes that happened around the same time in the north, in around Santa Maria de Iquique. And the formation of this party that he created, the Partido Obrero Socialista, was a culmination of very hot, intense debate with kind of like the top anarchist thinkers of the time that had also been very heavy into organizing. And interestingly enough, Recabaren had reached many of the same conclusions that Marx did when he was debating, anarchists in Europe with Proudhon and Bakunin and all of those guys. And he would also reach very similar conclusions as to Lenin on the question of national liberation, on revolutionary patriotism, even way before Lenin's writings had even gotten to Chile. Who was the first person to talk about Marx around Chile, like the first big organizer to talk about Marx, and who he would call him Marsch, like M-A-R-S-C-H. And that was because the books Marxist books haven't actually even gotten to Chile. He had gotten most of these ideas like fresh off the sailors that had been sailing around the world. And around by 1917, the Russian Revolution had happened. Around the same time that Recabarren had organized all of the big mutual aid societies into a big workers' federation called the FOCH, the Federation of Chilean Workers, which was also under the leadership of the Partido Obrero Socialista, the POS. And by 1920, Recabarren would go visit the Soviet Union. And he would come back, and he was amazed at what they were doing there. They were still going through a tough time in the Soviet Union because they were still in civil war, fighting off all of the imperialist powers that were trying to crush the Bolshevik baby in his crib. And but they were marching on, and that inspired him, and he went back to Chile, and he kind of told everyone about the party about this. And in 1921 they changed the name from Partido Obrero Socialista to Partido Comunista de Chile.
That's interesting that he changed the name around that time period, because if I'm not mistaken, within the global socialist movement at the time, there was a big disagreement between the social democrats, who were more connected with the label socialist, and the Bolsheviks or the Zimmerwaldists, who were more aligned with the title communist, because of the Leninist interpretation of Marxism, of including anti-imperialism, of including a national liberation, which is something that a lot of social democrats and more bourgeois socialists in Western Europe were kind of opposed to. And I find it interesting that somewhere like Chile, where unfortunately within the left doesn't get a lot of credit in terms of socialist development. We hear about Russia, we hear about Germany. We don't hear much about Chile globally in terms of socialism. And I think it's beautiful to see how he was able to arrive at the same conclusions around the same time and impart that wisdom into Chile to create one of the oldest communist parties. I think that's really fascinating.
Yeah, and well, I think it also speaks a little bit to kind of like the universality of kind of Marxism-Leninism. There's many people online that you'll find that say, communism is just for white people. It was made by white people. In reality, here you have someone who's from, in a country that's subjugated by imperialism, by British and American imperialism, and he's reaching the same conclusions just as even just before the books that Marx and Lenin would go on and write, and sometimes before they would even get to the country. So it sort of shows that these ideas are applicable even in the most kind of remote country you could find. And well, Recabarren, he was very popular at this time, but around 1920, the party was sort of faced by the fact that a social democrat known as Arturo Alessandri, this very popular man, he was sort of, he wasn't ideologically social democrat the same way that, I don't know, the Mensheviks were in Russia or something. It's just that social democrat was just, it could just be like the most closest to label you could find, because a lot of these labels hadn't reached Chile yet. And Arturo Alessandri was very popular. He was nicknamed El León de Tarapacá, the Lion of Tarapacá, the Lion of the North. And he had won by promising social reform. And people really loved him during his campaign. You would have old ladies, they would have like the cross next to the door, and they would also have a portrait of Arturo Alessandri, and they would like pray for his safety and things like that. And sadly, during his presidency, he wasn't allowed to pass any of his social reforms because there was a corrupt and kind of oligarchic, elitist parliament that would veto anything that he would try to pass. And the fact that nothing would pass under none of the social programs would pass under Alessandri, this would make the Communist Party even more and more popular, as more and more people would be fed up with institutionalism. But around 1924, Luis Emilio Recabarren, who was found dead with 3 shots to the back of his head, and the police would confirm this as a suicide. And this would enrage the working class in the north, to the point that there were many workers willing to kind of use the same dynamite that they would use for their mines to blow up their bosses' offices. And in response to this, the Communist Party made its own investigation, and they came to the same conclusion as the police. And it sort of speculated that this was done either because the Communist Party felt like it wasn't strong enough to achieve a victory in the revolution, and other people kind of speculate this is because of internal fighting within the party itself. And some people think that it was another member of the Communist Party that killed Recabarren. Either way, Recabarren's funeral was massive. You can find videos of this still on YouTube, and you can see how much support, how much fervor people had for Recabarren. This guy was basically the most important man in union organizing history in Chile, because it was him who he organized the first unions that would later on become like the most combative throughout the 20th century. And well, later that year, that around like 1925, 2 top generals of the Chilean army, General Ibáñez del Campo and Marmaduke Grove, who we'll hear a bit about later, as well as their subordinates, they enacted the first saber rattle to force the parliament to raise military wages, as well as create a minimum wage in the country, and pass many of the popular reforms that Alessandri had promised, but that had been vetoed constantly by the parliament.
One question, sorry to interrupt. One question I had about Recabarren, I'm not sure if you are not aware about it, but did he have any contact with Mariátegui in Peru, Jose Carlos Mariátegui, and also Sandino in Nicaragua, and at the same time Facundo Martí? Because around that time period, like especially when he was coming back from the Soviet Union in the early 20s, there was also the rise of the Partido Comunista Centroamericano that was organized by Facundo Martí in El Salvador, that also was making links with Sandino in Nicaragua. And at the same time, Mariátegui in Peru was also writing about indigenous communism, about Latin American communism. And so I was just wondering if you think he had any connects with them. I know back then it was kind of hard, right? Because we don't have Facebook or Twitter, but I'm curious to know if you think he had any links with them.
From what I've read, no, but he did have links with establishing the Communist Party of Argentina. He had been in exile for a while, just before creating the Partido Obrero Socialista in Argentina around Mendoza, and he created various socialist groups over there. Meanwhile, he was over there, and then when he was sort of in the clear, he kind of came back to Chile sort of illegally. So no, but I think that had he lived a little longer, he probably would. But it's interesting. Mariátegui wouldn't have much influence in Chile until until around 1970s, and around the same time, you would see the kind of like the biggest and highest level of militancy from and kind of political mobilization from the Mapuches in the south. But we'll get to that later.
Yeah.
And well, going back in time, in 1927, Alessandri, he had to renounce under pressure of the general Carlos Ibáñez del Campo, who sort of did a coup on him and established himself as dictator. And from 1927 to 1931, the Communist Party is illegalized. It is illegal at that point. And well, they would think that that was the end of the Communist Party and all of the kind of troublemakers that they had to deal with. But by 1929, Chile is heavily impacted by the kind of the Wall Street crash in the Great Depression, and this destroyed the Chilean economy. And at the same time, nitrates weren't as valuable as before, because during World War I, forgot to mention, the Germans had discovered how to create artificial nitrates. So kind of like the cash cow of the whole country, it wasn't worth as much as before. So people were living in very dire straits during this time. And the crisis hit so hard that in 1932, Chile had a series of presidential coups, one after another. And we had like 8 governments in 2 months. And one of these governments was the socialist government of Marmaduke Grove, one of the 2 generals that did the saber rattle. And he had implemented a government that had a 30-point program, which was it included lowering the wages of parliamentarians and of the president as well, recognizing the Soviet Union, creating the Ministry of Health, raising the minimum wage, a lot of things like that. During this time, and this government, it only lasted for 2 weeks. And during this time, Salvador Allende, he was Minister of Health. And well, after that, it ended with another coup of another general, and then another. And the whole chaos of this period, it ended with the second presidency of Alessandri, who was much more moderate this time. And well, the following year, 1933, the Partido Socialista de Chile was founded by a coalition of a lot of like stray groups that had been around. And Allende is one of the founders, as well as Marmaduke Grove. It was originally founded as an anti-fascist, a third worldist, a nationalist, and an anti-Soviet party, because they disagreed with the use of gulags in the Soviet Union. So this was like a big point of kind of divide within the left during this period. And there was a lot of propaganda going around about it, about how the gulag would be used. They kind of they had like a different kind of plan to get into power in mind that was different from the Communist Party. They supported a plan of helping push forward state-owned and subsidized industry to further industrialize the country, and therefore you would have a bigger proletariat. And well, by 1932, just a year before, the Communist Party was it was legal once again. So 1932 was the year in which communism expanded beyond just kind of the north in the Pampa into urban areas, into student movements, into academic circles, into overall just like cultural circles. And this was thanks to the incorporation of the Communist Party into the formal political system. And some of like the big intellectuals that joined the party, you could find Vicente Huidobro, a very important poet, Gabriela Mistral, a Nobel Prize winner for literature, as well as Pablo Neruda. You can read about him all over Latin America. You go to school in Latin America, they make you read Pablo Neruda, and even the works of Shakespeare are translated by Pablo Neruda. So it doesn't matter where you go, you'll probably have to read Pablo Neruda if you go to high school in Latin America.
And it's interesting that around this time period, like we're talking about the early 1930s, you have in the West the Great Depression, right? In the United States, 1929, the stock market tanks, and the U.S. enters a big recession, the biggest recession and depression in its history. And it makes sense around the world that people turn to socialism and communism because meanwhile, you have the Soviet Union, which was leading the fastest industrialization going on in the world in a place where just a few years before was considered a feudal backwater. Like, I think the conditions in Russia before the Russian Revolution were kind of similar to what was going on in Chile, right? The semi-feudalism, latifundias, you had these landed elites who had been there forever. And to see a country like Russia and the Soviet people rise up against feudal oppression, I think must have been inspiring and just common sense for people in Chile. So it's no surprise that around this time period in the 1930s, you had such an enthusiasm for communism.
Yeah, and well, it would continue to grow and grow and grow. It was just a matter of organizing and a matter of time at the end. It was also, interestingly enough, in the 1930s was also a big time of the popularity of being very anti-fascist in Chile, because of the war in Spain and because of kind of like these solidarity campaigns, many of them that were kind of organized by Pablo Neruda himself, sending food and humanitarian aid to the Spanish Republic. And around the same time, around 1936, the Comintern over in the USSR puts forth a program to create popular fronts to stop the global march of fascism around the world, which in Chile you would start to also see fascist groups as well. You would have the Nazis there, but it was interesting. In Chile, the Nazis would call themselves this kind of like German Third Reich fans. They would call themselves Nazis, but with a C instead of a Z. But either way, in Chile, the Communist Party and the Socialist Party, they unite together with the center-left Radical Party. And it's kind of this party that represented the petite bourgeoisie, and they created the Chilean Popular Front. And by 1938, they won the presidency with a man known as Pedro Aguirre Cerda. He was kind of a working class Joe type of guy. He was from the Radical Party, and his politics were somewhat similar to Juan Domingo Perón, like Perón from Argentina. You would find a lot of politicians around South American politics that are sort of similar to Perón. It was a very interesting phenomenon you would find here and there. And well, Pedro Aguirre Cerda, he incentivizes public education like never before. His main slogan is "Gobernar es educar," to govern is to educate. Allende, once again, he's also a minister of health during this time. And Pedro Aguirre Cerda, he sort of swears in front of him that he'll never give up his presidential sash alive until he completes his term. Interestingly enough, this would influence Allende all the way up to his death. You'll see later on. And though having talked a bit about anti-fascism, by 1939, Pablo Neruda, he organizes a kind of an expedition of boats to go save Spanish refugees from the Civil War, and they bring them back to Chile. And with these Spanish refugees, they're also, they're also communists. They're also members of the Socialist and Communist Party, and they also kind of make socialism grow throughout the country as well. Around 1941, Pedro Aguirre Cerda, he dies of tuberculosis. As he said before, he dies with his presidential sash on. And well, after this, the Socialist Party, which had done very well during this government, they split into three parts. And they lose a lot of relevancy because of it. And well, after 1945, with the end of World War II, the Soviet Union and Stalin are seen as like the vanquishers of fascism. And in Chile, that's no exception. Ignoring what's normally taught in U.S. high schools, they tried to make it look as if it was Uncle Sam who beat the Nazis. No, 9 out of 10 Nazis that were killed in World War II were killed by Soviet soldiers. So they got the brunt of the war.
The crazy part about that, too, is the fact that in these anti-communist books, like the Black Book of Communism, they include the deaths of Nazis as deaths by communism, which I think is fucking ridiculous. And it's just, I'm glad you pointed that out, because around the world, it's only in the U.S., I think, that a lot of people, the young people, are taught in schools that the U.S. won World War II and defeated the Nazis, when it was really the communists and the Soviets who did that.
Yeah, here in Chile as well, you get a very U.S. narrative, and I would have to say that that's a bit of the legacy of the cultural imperialism that you see here as well. You see it in some parts of Latin America as well. But back then, at this time, everyone had just heard about this, fresh off the news, that the Soviets had sort of won the European front here. And well, this gives the Communist Party a whole lot of political clout, and they kind of take that clout with them to the next presidential race, and they support another radical member of the Radical Party in Chile, who is known as Gabriel González Videla, and he won the presidency in great thanks because of the Communist Party and how much clout that they had. They were the big anti-fascists at that time. And having won this presidency for Gabriel, the Communist Party kind of takes advantage of this inertia, and they go on a series of worker strikes and mobilization. And to Videla's surprise, as well as everyone else's at the time, the Communist Party managed to get 17% of the vote in kind of parliamentary elections and in municipal elections. And they even managed to reorganize his cabinet without his presence. And with this, the U.S., Uncle Sam, they kind of approach Videla, seeing that they're now in a Cold War with the USSR. And they asked him, what are these communists doing in his government, and what are they doing reorganizing his cabinet? So in around 1948, Videla passes something that is called the Law of Defense and Democracy, which the communists kind of nicknamed La Ley Maldita, the damned law, because it outlaws the Communist Party once again. But this time they feel kind of like they got stabbed in the back, because they helped this guy get into office, and if it wasn't for them, he wouldn't be the president. Pablo Neruda, he kind of writes this kind of famous phrase. It's you can cut all the flowers you want, but you can't stop spring from coming. And with that, there was a big crackdown on the party. It would be nothing as harsh as what would come later on in the 70s. But these guys were kept regularly in internment camps. And Salvador Allende, who was a senator at this time, he would regularly visit these camps in solidarity with the Communist Party. And one time, the man in charge of one of these camps had threatened to shoot him. And little did he know that he would later cross paths with the same man, and that this would leave a mark on the whole country. And the name of this man was Augusto Pinochet. So even before Allende had taken power, Pinochet had threatened his life.
That's crazy.
So, all right, going back, in the 1950s, the Communist Party, while being illegal, they start off this squat movement, this movement in which they organize kind of poor people to go and take land and kind of squat there. And they turned this into a movement for housing rights and called it the pobladores. You can even find pobladores today in Chile. By the same time, around the 1950s, the Socialist Party had more or less sort of gotten itself together, and they launched Allende's first candidacy in 1952, and it got meager results, and barely anyone voted for him. And the next following year, 1953, thanks to this series of industrializing projects under something that was called the Corfo, there's a much more bigger and diversified proletariat throughout the country. And this gave way to the creation of a mega union called the CUT, the Central Única de Trabajadores, the one and only center of workers. They had kind of this clear idea that they wanted to abolish capitalism in Chile, and they wanted to advance to a society with no classes. They kind of reivindicated the idea of class combat as their method of action and their political method as well. And they kind of assumed this kind of class-based and independent character as well. And the creation of this mega union was thanks to the work of a man called Clotario Blest Rifo, who was kind of this liberation theologian, and he was the head of this of the Public Workers Association. And Clotario Blest, he's still loved by the working class in Chile today. Even many who, today you'll find a lot of people who don't even who are working class, and they don't even identify as socialist. But you ask them about Clotario Blest, and they'll say that man was a real man. He was the one that made the unions actually work as unions.
And the fact that he was religious, I think, is interesting because liberation theology around this time in the 60s was really starting to take off in terms of combining the Catholic teachings with socialism. You had like Camilo Torres in Colombia. Later on, you have Monsignor Romero in El Salvador. And also the Sandinistas in Nicaragua were really inspired by liberation theology. And me as a communist, I'm sure you may feel the same way as well. Although I'm an atheist, I believe in science and dialectical materialism. I'm all for working with religious socialists from Latin America, because a lot of, the reality is, unfortunately, that most of our countries are very Catholic or very religious. And we have to meet the people where they're at. And if religion and liberation theology is a way to work with the masses, to teach the people about why capitalism is evil and bad, I think that's certainly a good starting point toward moving toward a more Marxist-Leninist, a dialectical materialist direction.
Yeah, I agree. And the thing is, sadly, the thing is that as much as in Chile, as I understand in Honduras, kind of the main day that working class people have their day off is on Sundays. And on Sundays, they spend a big chunk of Sunday at church. So, you meet them where they at, and they're at church. You kind of click with their values, and there's a lot of things about socialism that click with the same, values and teachings of the Bible as well. And it was interesting. Clotario was very interesting because you mentioned that it was in the 60s that this exploded throughout all of Latin America. Well, this man was a liberation theologist in the 50s. So it was a little bit just before. He was just one of the first ones to get into this. And this sort of gave liberation theology a little bit of a head start in Chile than in other parts of Latin America that would later catch on as well. And in the 50s, there was also the creation of something that was called the Frente de Acción Popular, where it was a coalition between the Socialist and Communist Party, which became the predecessor of the Popular Unity as well. And also within this time, many of the members of the Communist Party and of the Socialist Party were also Catholics as well. So they were starting to catch on and starting to kind of connect their Catholic values with socialist values as well. And 2 years later, Carlos Ibáñez del Campo, he won the presidency this time democratically, and he took away the damned law, and the Communist Party was back in action. They were legal once again. And the next following year, 1959, you had Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, and Camilo Cienfuegos walking to La Habana, having defeated Fulgencio Batista's forces, and they liberated Cuba. And this greatly influenced the Chilean left as well, since it changed the perspectives on how to achieve revolution through non-institutional means. Allende himself, he visited Cuba just a couple of days after Fidel, Che, and Camilo Cienfuegos had taken La Habana, and he had met Che and Fidel, and he made friends with them over there, and he started the first his first kind of correspondence with them. Next following year, 1960, the CUT, the mega union, they managed to reach a membership of 1 million members in a country of 10 million people. And this was all thanks to Clotario Blest again. A couple of years later, Clotario Blest, he sort of retires, sort of an old man at this point. If you see any pictures of him, you always see a picture of him as an old man with a wispy beard. And in 1964, 4 years later, this one presidential candidate from the Democratic Christian Party, this sort of centrist party, wins the election with help of the CIA, with funds sent in from the CIA, so that he could win the election to stop Allende from winning the election. And Allende, he lost, he had gotten about like 38% of the vote around this time. And Frei also wins a bit nearly as well here as well. And in 1964, the same year as Frei wins this election, this rigged election, rigged by a foreign country, the U.S. likes to talk about Russia intervening all the time. Well, they did that in our country a lot of times.
Yeah.
And in 1964, various groups that were either enchanted by the Cuban Revolution or that were disenchanted with, the institutional methods that kept on, screwing with them and, kind of changing the game unfairly, they get together and they form, and in the next year, in 1965, they formed something that was called the Movimiento Giarda Revolucionaria, which originally it was kind of this very heterogeneous group. You could find anarchists, Trotskyists, ex-members of the Socialist Party, ex-members of the Communist Party, kind of disappointed members of the social Democrat Radical Party that had been with Pedro Aguirre Cerda. And this was sort of the first party to openly declare that their means of achieving power was through revolution. The other parties, they were all institutionalized. 1956, the Communist Party of Chile had been kind of like influenced by Khrushchev and the coexistence between capitalism and communism idea. And they weren't too big about revolution anymore. And here, 1960s, you have this rebirth of the idea of, we can go and we can do it. And this coincided at the same time that President Frey had mobilized the peasantry, quite ironically, through an agrarian reform that was designed to stop the peasantry from mobilizing itself. And it was a very half-assed reform. It was aimed at stopping the communists from taking all over, all the lands and eating all the babies and all other type of propaganda that you had there. And the Mir they just go to it, and they start getting involved in these peasant masses, and they also get a following in the shanty towns and urban areas by carrying the torch and promoting the housing movement and mobilizing more and more squads. And in 1967, the Mir had this very beautiful Congress where they got rid of all the Trotskyists and they kicked them out.
Yeah.
And they established Mir as a Marxist-Leninist party under the leadership of Miguel Enriquez, who was a very brilliant man, who was very admired by Fidel Castro as well. This group, Mir, was also very heavily influenced by dependency theorists from Brazil, some of whom just straight up joined Mir as well, such as Rey, oh my gosh, I keep on forgetting his name, Rey, I know Teodinho dos Santos joins Mir, various different members that I can't remember their names properly, so I'm not going to mispronounce Portuguese right now.
Yeah. It's like Mauro Maurini or something like that? Or
yes, him.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
He joins Mir, and 2 years later, 1969, Mir starts its armed campaign against the Chilean state through a series of robberies to fund the party. And the same year, 1969, the youth wing of the Democratic Christian Party of Frey's party splits off from the Democratic Christians, and they form something that's called the Movimiento de Acción Popular Unitaria, or MAPU for short. And they sort of started being influenced by liberation theology. Meanwhile, they were kind of mobilized by the peasantry and radicalized by this kind of very half-assed agrarian reform that they felt that didn't go far enough. And they had eventually, by this year, 1969, they became Marxists, and they were very influenced by Althusser from France and by his reading of Leninism. They wanted to be the third big party of Chile. It was interesting. They didn't want to go for first place. They wanted to go for third place because they didn't want to compete with the Socialist or Communist Party. They sort of saw the Communist Party as like, mere agents of Moscow. They saw the Socialist Party as this kind of anarchic bolsa de gatos, this bag of cats, where you had Trotskyists, anarchists, revisionists, anti-revisionists, all just circling around there. They would create a lot of tension and disputes, and they sort of didn't want to deal with that. And in the same year, 1969, the Popular Unity is formed, la Unidad Popular. And they have Salvador Allende as their presidential candidate. And they create this coalition with the support of the Socialist Party, the Communist Party, MAPU, the Radical Party, which at this point was much more smaller, and Christian socialist groups as well. And to prevent Allende from winning the election, a part of the military tried to create a coup right before the elections, but they failed. And this creates support for institutionality in the Constitution as well. Also, on the very day that Allende was supposed to assume the presidency, there was another coup attempt, also helped and led by the CIA, but they were met by, his thousands of supporters, as well as parts of the military that were still loyal to the government. And this creates even more support for constitutionalism within the military, especially. And in 1970, the Popular Unity, or Unidad Popular, they win the vote. And this is in great part thanks to the fact that Frei, his presidency was so polarizing and so chaotic that it broke the coalition that the Christian Democrats had with the right-wing parties. So since they ran all independently, Allende managed to win just by a slight margin. And this infuriates the CIA and Nixon and Henry Kissinger and all those old, demons from hell.
Goblins.
Oh yeah, those goblins. And Nixon, he orders the Pentagon to make the economy scream, to make sure that no one looks at Chile as an example. And at the start of the Popular Unity, the government, things were going pretty well. And as workers would take their factories, they would even increase production. There was an increase of production and an increase of wages during this time as well. And the MIR, they also went into full action, motivating workers to take over the factories and peasants to take over their latifundios, these kind of feudal serf kind of systems in the South, and to nationalize them. And MIR was not part of the Popular Unity, but they were critical supporters. They used this period as a vehicle to work, out in the open and to radicalize the masses. And then around the next year, 1971, Allende nationalized all of the copper mines and put them to work to fund social programs for the poor. And this further enraged Nixon and Henry Kissinger and made their faces turn, purple. And interestingly enough, in Chile, this was greeted by massive support, even by 6 sectors of the Chilean middle class that weren't socialists, and they didn't vote for Allende. This had around an 80% of approval around in the country, and Allende had won with 36% of the vote. So you had a lot of people that weren't socialists, never became socialists, but loved the fact that their country was finally using its own copper for its own people. And around the next year, 1972, under an ever-growing invisible blockade, because Nixon had kind of part of his plan to make the economy scream, he had established a kind of a blockade on key elements or key sectors of the economy so that it would scream, so that they couldn't trade with anyone, so that they couldn't get anyone to send supplies to Chile either. And there was also, organized protests and sabotage from the political right and from, very openly fascist groups such as Fatherland and Liberation.
It's crazy because as you say that, I immediately think about Venezuela with the Guarimberos, with the La Derecha, the Escuálidos, who are backed and supported by the US, who are supported by the National Endowment for Democracy, and who are portrayed as revolutionaries, but their only function is to destabilize socialist construction, to blame all the problems on the socialist government, and thus bring back capitalism and neoliberalism. And it's insane that, as you say that, literally, I was imagining Venezuela, I was imagining Nicaragua, I was imagining, the recent coup in Bolivia, and all these tactics continue to go on until this day.
Yeah, all those freedom fighters. How dare you ever criticize those freedom fighters like Fatherland and Liberation?
Right.
Take away your freedom from buying McDonald's. But either way, this as well as what you can find is in Venezuela today, back in 1972, every day was, full of, conflict, full of, massive fistfights would come out in the street in front of the presidential palace between left-wing groups and right-wing groups. You would have mere, throwing it down with Fatherland and Liberation. Every single day, you would have old ladies try to beat up old men because they had different political opinions. You would even have fascists dress up as cops and try to shoot people on the street. So it was massive confusion. Also in the year 1972, because of all of this sabotage and blockade, and sabotage, you could talk to go into a little bit about that. You would have some people would try to kind of like hoard food, because interestingly enough, even though food production and production in general went up in the country, you would find less and less things available to buy. So the thing was that people were, hoarding food on purpose and hoarding products on purpose. And you can even find this in a documentary called "The Battle for Chile." Even I've been told, because during this time, my grandfather, he was a member of the police by other people whose grandfathers were also police, that their grandfathers would hoard food during this time to try to destabilize the government. You would also have the truck drivers. I know there's this similarity between Chilean and Brazilian truck drivers, that they're both fascist, both very pro-fascist, that they would keep on making strikes and prevent food from coming and letting food rot.
Yeah.
This also created scarcity, and this also created a period in which there was a massive inflation and a big economic crisis. There's also a very intense media propaganda attack against the government. And you would have a lot of things that were sort of goofy, such as communists found eating babies, or that people would say that Allende had a crocodile in the presidential palace that was given to him by Fidel. and he would feed babies to it every day. And then you would have more sinister things, such as the very famous Plan Z. And this was sort of like a made-up plan that said that Allende was going to enact a self-coup and put the MIR into power and use an army of Cuban soldiers to enact a bloody civil war and kill all of the soldiers in the army, even the loyalist ones, and kill all the men, women, and babies in the upper-class neighborhoods. And all of this was, created to try to break support from the loyalist soldiers. And we'd see later on that it worked. Always be a little, and even to today, you'll find some people in Chile that'll say that their grandpa was on the blacklist of Allende.
Yeah,
they had this imaginary blacklist of names, and they would lie to people and say, you're on this blacklist, you're going to be murdered. It was all a bunch of lies. Around the end of September 1973, there's this kind of attempt from the military to enact another coup, but they're met by Pinochet's garrison, and he stops this coup attempt. And because of that, he's put as general of the army. And a couple of days later, on September 8th, he's filled in by the other generals that are going to get into the coup, that if he doesn't join them, he'll be killed along with Allende. So he joins them. The next following day, September 9th, all of the kind of more revolutionary socialist members of the Popular Unity and the MIR, they kind of discover about this coup attempt in a couple more days, and they publicly announce all of the members of the coup, all of the plotters. At the end, the coup goes ahead anyways. Pinochet, Allende, at first he's shocked to see that no one in the military is listening to him anymore. And, he's also shocked to see that his main man at that point, Pinochet, was, he was orchestrating this coup. And before having known that, he had said to himself, poor Pinochet, I wonder where he is. Later on, he would get the call from Pinochet calling him to resign immediately. He would kick the floor saying, that traitorous bastard. And for the next several hours, he would use this AK-47 that was gifted him by Castro, along with his garrison. They would fend off the military for several hours. He eventually made a speech on the radio where he announced that, history is ours. It's made by the people. That was his last big, announcement before having died. He then, soon after, he takes his own life, and then the presidential palace would be bombed by the Air Force shortly after. Then the military would, they went all out on all the communists and socialists. They would turn this national stadium into a concentration camp, and they kill around 3,000 people around the first couple of days. The Communist Party, it becomes shattered. There's not much, there's not much documentation after the coup, since it splits into many different factions that mostly go to exile in different places. The MIR, they get, also a lot of repression during this time. In 1974, Miguel Enriquez, the head of the MIR, he dies in a shootout with the military and the police. And ironically enough, the Communist Party, which had become so institutional, they would continue supporting institutionalism to an absurd point. In 1978, they would try to make a coalition with the Democratic Christians, who had been involved in overthrowing them. So now, around 1978 as well, MIR is left with only 50 members, and they kind of they make a new strategy called Operación Retorno, where they train all of their exiled members in Cuba and they bring them back to Chile. And around the same time, the communists, most of the Communist Party that's still in Chile, they're sort of fed up with the institutionality of the Communist Party. In the 1980s, the MIR, they reignite their military campaign and they start to mobilize sectors of the population that had sort of remained dormant at this time, and even some sectors, some very young people that didn't even remember Allende anymore. They were just too young and they sort of didn't understand what was happening. And 1982, the economy goes into a deep crisis. Funny enough, life under Pinochet was, most of the time, it was economic crisis. From 1973 to 1976, the economy was still in shambles after the Nixon had made it scream. And, the generals had refused to implement, the economic measures of the neoliberal Chicago boys. They preferred to put an aviator general that didn't know anything about economics as the Minister of Economics for 3 years. So Pinochet, he only gives way to neoliberalism as his kind of last resort to prevent him from being killed from his own secret police. And during this time in the 1980s, it was illegal to be in meetings or events with people outside of your family. And this was done to prevent any clandestine party meetings. But it also made it so that no one could actually party legally. And since no one could legally party, this made Pinochet very unpopular among the youth, because people like to party. And it's super, during this time, it was seen as super unpopular to be young and to actually like Pinochet.
Right.
People would poke fun at you. Also in the 1980s, you would have the creation of the Frente Patriótico Manuel Rodriguez, which was the armed wing of the Communist Party. And, also in 1983, you would have this kind of this explosion of protests. So it all culminated at the same time, at the right time. And these protests would go on and off, and they would see their climax around 1986. The Frente Patriótico would try to kill Pinochet that year. And they tried to kill him with a rocket launcher, and basically their rocket didn't blow up. It hit the seat right next to Pinochet. He sort of looked at it, and it didn't blow up. And after that, there was a big crisis. The Frente Patriótico, they would break off from the Communist Party.
Yeah.
MIR would later split into 3 parts in 1987. The really interesting thing was that that very same year, a very different guerrilla group called Movimiento Juvenil Lautaro started its most serious campaign at the same time as all these other guerrillas were in dismay. 1988, Pinochet was basically forced by the will of his own people to hold an election on whether he would stay in power. If you were to vote yes, he would stay indefinitely. If you were to vote no, he would have to go. And there would be a liberal democracy established, supposedly. The vote for no won by 56%, whereas the vote for yes got 44% of the vote. And this meant that 44% of the country was also fascist.
Yeah. And a lot of the people, like, I know eventually by the 90s, he was gone. And a lot of into the 90s and the early 2000s, a lot of the people who were in the Pinochet dictatorship actually stayed in Chile. And they're still in power today, a lot of them, right? And, even though there was in the 1990s the collapse of the Soviet Union, or the overthrow of the Soviet Union, we see that the socialist revolutionary activity still carried on in Chile. Even until today, we see in 2019, last year, there were huge protests against Piñera, and you have a left that's combining the indigenous Mapuche national liberation struggle, but also the class struggle of people in Chile. And so just kind of wrapping up here, and I'm so glad you gave us this overview of the history of socialism in Chile. Where is the socialist struggle in Chile today? And lastly, also, how can we follow Revista de Frente?
Well, the socialist struggle is it's very interesting because there's a crisis of all the institutional parties and of parties in general. It's kind of a very anti-party sentiment around the people, and that's helped them not to be fooled by by the institutional parliamentary parties or by the right wing in any sort of way. But at the same time, it's sort of without any sort of leading vanguard organization. It sort of has created moments and periods between 2019 and now in which sometimes it just wasn't, clarity, or sometimes, the energy of protests would go down. But now I'd say that people are becoming more and more open to the idea of socialism. It's still more or less scary for a lot of people. The government still uses its favorite boogeyman of all time, Venezuela, to kind of scare people,
right,
from even considering creating a new constitution. And the next following month in November, there's going to be a vote for a new constitution.
Yeah.
I think that it's going to come through, but the real pressing question is what comes after the creation of a new constitution.
Yeah.
And also, how does it come about? Because that's only the first step of the battle. Then the next battle that would come would be, creating a real constitution that can actually abide by, popular radical forces and let popular radical forces, take power and change society.
Definitely.
And that's going to be another huge, battle with the political right, who's also going to try to use, its own twist of language to kind of, fool people. And also, we're also going to have to see what comes after Constitution. There's also cases in Latin America where you get the creation of beautiful constitutions that don't lead to anything at the end. I remember hearing, I have Colombian friends that have told me that, they have a very beautiful constitution that was born out of a very intense struggle. But at the end, the government never listens to it. It's just there. It's just written. It's never actually followed.
Right.
So all of that is in the air. There's a lot of talk about, of who are going to be the delegates to debate about, the central points of the new constitution. There's a lot of talk about the presidential elections, which is funny because Piñera still has 2 more years to go, but everyone just forgot about it.
Everyone wants him to get the fuck out of there, basically. Yeah, no, it's crazy. I mean, I think in Chile, it has such a beautiful history of socialism, of revolutionary activism. And I'm glad we were able to discuss this. We can go on and on forever, but I know just for brevity and for our listeners and viewers, I think we did a pretty decent job at going over the basics of socialism in Chile. And there's so much more to research. And again, everybody, we spoke with Bruno Fuentes, who's a writer for Revista de Frente, based in Santiago, Chile. Revista de Frente is an independent media collective that does guerrilla reporting. Bruno, how can we follow Revista de Frente?
You can follow Revista de Frente at over on Twitter at defrente_CL, or also in our online blog, which is revistadefrente.cl altogether, and in lowercase letters. And currently, we're also, looking for recruits, for people who are also interested in writing about the struggles, that are happening in the U.S. and more specifically in the Latin American community in the U.S. If you want to hit us up, just talk to us through our Twitter, and we'll get in contact with you. We're also going to be doing some workshops with an important Argentinian socialist intellectual, Atilio Boron, and on how to do reporting, on how to be a better reporter. And well, if you're interested, don't be afraid.
That's what's up. And we'll definitely put the links to Revista de Frente in the description. Make sure to sign up to follow them. They're doing some really great cutting edge reporting, independent, revolutionary, socialist media. We need to support each other as Latin American socialist communists. That's what Anticonquista is about. Again, my name is Ramiro. I'm a co-editor of Anticonquista, anti-imperialist media collective for the Latin American and Caribbean diaspora. Bruno, peace out, man. It was great talking to you, and I hope to visit you in Chile soon, all right?
All right.
All right, brother. Take care. Take care.